He used to fly F-16s at Mach 1.5, life-or-death missions where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home or not coming home at all. Now, Frank Ace Thompson flies a beat-up Cessna 188 at 140 miles per hour over Nebraska cornfields, spraying crops for farmers who call him by his first name and pay him in cash. It was supposed to be the perfect retirement. Blue skies, peaceful flights, no more enemies trying to shoot him down. Until that Tuesday morning when the enemies found him anyway, and suddenly a 62-year-old crop duster had to become a fighter pilot one more time. Welcome to Echo Stories. Before we dive into this incredible story of how the past never really stays buried, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button to help us honor the quiet heroes who walk among us. The alarm went off at 5:15 a.m., same as it had every morning for the past 15 years. Frank Thompson rolled out of bed in his small farmhouse outside Hastings, Nebraska, population 24,000, where everybody knew everybody and nothing exciting ever happened. That's exactly how Frank liked it. At 62, with graying hair and hands weathered by decades of gripping control sticks, Frank had found his perfect retirement. No more military brass breathing down his neck. No more missions where you didn't know if you'd see tomorrow. Just him, his plane, and the endless Nebraska sky. Frank's Cessna 188 wasn't much to look at. White with blue trim, older than most of the farmers' kids, held together with experience and stubbornness. But she flew true. And that's all that mattered when you were dusting crops 12 hours a day during season. The locals called him Ace, though most of them thought it was just because he was good at his job. They had no idea that Frank Thompson had once been Captain Franklin J. Thompson, United States Air Force, with over 2,500 hours of combat flight time in some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. He preferred it that way. Frank's morning routine was sacred. Coffee black, 2 pieces of toast, check the weather reports, pre-flight inspection, and wheels up by 6:30 a.m. Today was Tuesday, which meant the Henderson farm first, 800 acres of corn that needed a fungicide treatment before the afternoon heat set in. The Cessna coughed to life like she always did, and Frank felt that familiar satisfaction as the engine settled into its steady rhythm. Below him, Nebraska stretched out in perfect geometric patterns, section roads dividing the landscape into mile-square grids, farmsteads dotting the horizon like islands in an ocean of green. This was freedom. Real freedom. Not the kind they talked about in military briefings, but the kind you felt in your bones when you were alone in an aircraft with nothing but sky ahead of you. Frank had been flying for 43 years, starting with a single-engine Cessna 152 when he was 19. The Air Force had refined that natural talent, turning him into something lethal and precise. But here, dusting crops over the heartland, he'd found something better than precision. He'd found peace. Frank was halfway through his second pass over the Henderson corn when he spotted it, a glint of metal where there shouldn't be any metal. His military training kicked in automatically: assess, analyze, act. The glint was coming from Morrison's back 40. A section of farmland that had been empty for 3 years since old Morrison died and his kids moved to Denver. Frank had flown over that land hundreds of times. He knew every fence post, every tree line, every drainage ditch. There was definitely something new. Frank banked the Cessna gently to the left, adjusting his approach to get a better look. What he saw made his blood run cold. A small aircraft, looked like a Piper Cherokee, was sitting in what used to be Morrison's soybean field. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, fuel barrels stacked nearby, and men moving around with purpose. They weren't farmers. Frank's fighter pilot instincts were screaming at him. Wrong aircraft, wrong location, wrong behavior patterns. In his Air Force days, this is what intel officers called indicators and warnings, the signs that something was about to go very, very wrong. Frank completed his pass over the Henderson farm as if nothing had happened, but his mind was racing. The Cherokee had Mexican registration numbers. He'd gotten close enough to see that. The fuel setup looked temporary but professional. And those men weren't wearing overalls and John Deere caps. This was drug trafficking. Had to be. Rural Nebraska was the perfect corridor. Low air traffic, minimal law enforcement presence, thousands of square miles of farmland where a small plane could land, refuel, and disappear without anyone noticing. Anyone, except a former fighter pilot who knew how to read airspace like a book. Frank finished his crop dusting run and headed back to his airstrip, mind working through the tactical situation. He needed to report this, but to whom? Local sheriff's office? They were good people, but they dealt with cattle theft and domestic disputes, not international drug smuggling. FBI? DEA? Frank hadn't talked to federal law enforcement since his discharge papers were signed 15 years ago, but as he touched down and taxied toward his hangar, Frank made a decision that would change his quiet retirement forever. He was going back for another look. Frank waited 2 hours, then took off again with a cover story ready. He'd forgotten to treat the northeast corner of the Henderson farm. It was thin, but it would hold up if anyone asked questions. The Cherokee was still there, but now there was activity. A second aircraft had arrived, a Beechcraft Bonanza, also with Mexican registration. Frank counted at least 6 men on the ground, and they were loading packages from a panel truck into the Beechcraft. Frank had seen this before, just not over Nebraska farmland. This was a hub-and-spoke operation. Drugs coming up from Mexico in small aircraft, landing at remote locations to refuel and transfer cargo, then continuing north to major distribution centers. Chicago was 400 miles northeast, Minneapolis 350 miles north, perfect range for light aircraft loaded with product. Frank circled wide, using every piece of aerial surveillance training the Air Force had ever given him. He memorized tail numbers, counted personnel, noted equipment. Old habits die hard, and reconnaissance had always been one of Frank's specialties. That's when the radio crackled to life. Unknown aircraft circling Sector 7, identify yourself immediately. The voice was professional, calm, and definitely not air traffic control. Frank's blood chilled as he realized the drug operation had its own air traffic coordinator. Frank keyed his mic, pitching his voice higher and adding a slight tremor. This is November 748 Delta, agricultural aircraft. Having some engine trouble, looking for a place to set down. -8 Delta, continue northeast and do not return to this area. The voice had an edge now. Frank looked down and saw one of the men pointing up at his Cessna. Roger that, sir, Frank replied, banking away. Engine smoothing out now, continuing to home base. But Frank wasn't heading home. He was positioning for what the Air Force called standoff surveillance, close enough to observe, far enough away to avoid detection. That's when he saw the third aircraft approaching from the south. The incoming aircraft was different, a modified Cessna 210 with long-range fuel tanks and no registration numbers visible. Frank's fighter pilot brain started doing calculations, approach speed, flight profile, load configuration. This wasn't cargo. This was transport. Frank watched through binoculars as the 210 touched down and taxied to the improvised operations area. 4 men got out, but these weren't smugglers. They moved with military precision, carried themselves like operators. Frank had seen enough cartel enforcers during his time flying missions along the Mexican border to know exactly what he was looking at. The operation was about to get violent. Frank keyed his radio to the emergency frequency and began broadcasting. Mayday, Mayday, this is November the 748 Delta reporting suspected drug trafficking operation in progress, coordinates. The response was immediate and terrifying. 8 Delta, you are ordered to land immediately or you will be shot down. Frank looked down and saw one of the men from the Cessna 210 pointing what looked like a military-grade surface-to-air missile launcher directly at him. Suddenly, a 62-year-old crop duster pilot was back in combat. Frank's muscle memory took over. 40 years dissolved in an instant as Captain Franklin J. Thompson returned to the cockpit. The Cessna 188 wasn't built for combat maneuvering, but Frank had been trained to make any aircraft do things it wasn't designed to do. He pushed the nose down hard, diving toward the deck as his mind calculated missile flight profiles and defensive tactics. The shoulder-fired missile streaked past his starboard wing, close enough that Frank could see the exhaust trail. In an F-16, he would have had chaff and flares, electronic countermeasures, afterburners. In a crop duster, he had experience and desperation. Frank leveled out 20 feet above the corn, using the terrain to mask his position. The Cessna's radial engine was screaming, but she was holding together. Behind him, he could hear radio chatter as the cartel team tried to coordinate a second shot. Frank keyed his emergency frequency again. "This is 8 Delta, taking missile fire from suspected cartel operation. Coordinates 40.87 north, 98.31 west. Request immediate federal response." That's when Frank heard the sound that changed everything. Another aircraft engine, closing fast from behind. The Cherokee was airborne and coming after him. Frank had been in air-to-air combat before, but never in a crop duster against drug runners over Nebraska farmland. The Cherokee had superior speed and maneuverability, but Frank had something the cartel pilot didn't have: 40 years of aerial combat experience and absolutely nothing to lose. Frank pulled the Cessna into a tight turn, using the aircraft's slow-speed handling to his advantage. The Cherokee overshot, exactly as Frank had planned. In the brief moment when the pursuit aircraft was out of position, Frank broadcast again. "Federal authorities, this is a former U.S. Air Force pilot currently engaged in aerial combat with cartel aircraft over rural Nebraska. I am marking my position with smoke." Frank pulled the lever that released his crop-dusting chemicals, creating a white trail behind his aircraft that would be visible for miles. The Cherokee pilot was good, but he wasn't military trained. Frank could see it in his flight patterns: aggressive but undisciplined, fast but predictable. Frank led the pursuit aircraft on a deadly game of cat and mouse over the Nebraska countryside, using every piece of cover he could find. He flew through farm equipment dealerships, between grain elevators, under power lines that would have made his old flight instructors court-martial him on the spot. But it was working. The Cherokee pilot was getting frustrated, making mistakes. Frank's radio crackled with federal frequencies: FBI, DEA, Air National Guard. Help was coming, but not fast enough. The Cherokee was lining up for another attack run when Frank saw his opportunity. Ahead was the Hastings Municipal Airport, Frank's home field. More importantly, it had a control tower and emergency services. Frank keyed his radio to the local frequency. "Hastings Tower, this is 8 Delta declaring emergency. Incoming hot with hostile aircraft in pursuit. Clear all traffic and alert authorities." 8 Delta, Hastings Tower, runway 12 cleared for emergency landing. Emergency vehicles standing by. Frank could see the Cherokee pilot hesitating. Landing at an airport would mean witnesses, radio recordings, federal attention. But Frank wasn't giving him a choice. Frank dropped the Cessna toward the runway as if he was making an emergency landing, then at the last second, pulled up and over the terminal building. The Cherokee, committed to the attack run, followed him down, right into the waiting guns of the FBI tactical response team that had been scrambled from the Omaha field office. Frank set the Cessna down on runway 12 as federal agents swarmed the Cherokee, which had been forced to land with its engine shot out by federal sharpshooters. As Frank shut down his engine, he could see news trucks already arriving, drawn by reports of aerial combat over Nebraska farmland. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos approached Frank's aircraft as he climbed out, her expression a mixture of professional authority and genuine amazement. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Special Agent Santos. Are you injured?" "No, ma'am. Just glad to be on the ground." "Sir, we've been monitoring federal frequencies. Did you just conduct single-handed aerial combat against a drug cartel?" Frank looked at his beat-up Cessna, then at the federal agents securing the Cherokee and its crew. "Ma'am, I just protected my airspace, same as I've been doing for 40 years. Within hours, Frank's story was national news. Crop duster pilot defeats drug cartel in aerial combat over Nebraska. But the media attention revealed something Frank had hoped to keep buried. Captain Franklin J. Thompson, call sign ACE, is credited with 47 confirmed victories in air-to-air combat during classified operations in the Middle East and Central America. Thompson was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Silver Star, and the Air Force Cross before retiring in 2008. The local farmers who had known Frank for 15 years suddenly understood why everyone called him Ace. At the Hastings diner the next morning, Frank tried to order his usual coffee and eggs, but found himself surrounded by neighbors who were seeing him with new eyes. "Frank," said Tom Henderson, whose corn Frank had been dusting when this all started, "why didn't you ever tell us you were a war hero?" Frank stirred his coffee slowly. "Tom, I wasn't trying to be a hero yesterday. I was just trying to keep drug dealers out of our sky. But all those medals, all those missions, That was a long time ago. This is my life now, flying over your corn, keeping your crops healthy, being part of this community. Yesterday was just an interruption. Agent Santos visited Frank at his airstrip the following week. The cartel operation had been completely rolled up. 13 arrests, 2 tons of cocaine seized, and a major trafficking route disrupted. Mr. Thompson, the DEA would like to offer you a consulting position. Your tactical aviation expertise could be invaluable in our counter-narcotics operations. Frank was checking the oil in his Cessna's radial engine. Agent Santos, I appreciate the offer, but I've got 800 acres of corn to dust next week. The Hendersons are counting on me. But sir, your skills... Frank closed the engine cowling and turned to face her. My skills kept me alive for 28 years in the Air Force. Now they help me grow food for families. That's not a step down, Agent Santos. That's just a different kind of service. 3 months later, Frank was back to his routine. Up at 5:15, coffee black, wheels up by 6:30. The only difference was the occasional federal aircraft that would appear on his wing. Agents checking in, making sure the most dangerous crop duster in America was okay. Frank didn't mind. He understood that some people need to keep fighting wars. But he'd found something better than winning battles. He'd found a way to help things grow. The Nebraska sky was still blue, the corn was still green, and farmers still paid him in cash for keeping their crops healthy. Frank Ace Thompson had saved the day, made national news, and been offered jobs that would have doubled his income. But every morning at 5:15, he still rolled out of bed in his small farmhouse, fired up his beat-up Cessna, and went to work protecting the only thing that had ever really mattered to him: home. And so, over the cornfields of Nebraska, we learned once again that heroes don't always wear uniforms or fly the newest aircraft. Sometimes they wear work clothes and fly old crop dusters, and they measure success not in enemies destroyed, but in harvests protected. Frank Thompson proved that retirement from military service doesn't mean retirement from service itself. It just means finding new ways to defend what matters. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, support Echo Stories by subscribing. See you in the next video. And remember, that quiet pilot flying over your hometown might just be a guardian angel with 47 confirmed victories and a heart full of love for the place he calls home.